It's easy to dismiss Freud on account of some of his wackier notions about human psychological development, or write him off as sexually obsessed, which, in all fairness, maybe he was. But nevertheless, Freud revolutionized the way that we think about the mind, and he more or less launched the field of psychoanalysis. In Freud's approach to psychology, we find that many of his insights have been so thoroughly accepted by the mainstream that we find them almost unremarkable now. And in that sense, Freud has been more of a victim of his own successes than of his failures. Freud himself perhaps put it best in an article that he wrote in 1917 entitled A Difficulty in the Path of Psychoanalysis. There, Freud famously described what he called the three great humiliations faced by human narcissism, all of which are encountered on the path of scientific inquiry that we embarked upon with the advent of the Enlightenment. The first was enacted by Copernicus, who furnished us with the knowledge that the sun did not revolve around the earth. This is the beginning of that horrifying realization that all of the universe is not centered around our planet upon which we are the reigning organism. The universe is perhaps not created for the sake of mankind. The next great scientific humiliation is effected by Charles Darwin, who hypothesizes that we are not created beings, but evolved beings. If human beings are not created by a designer, then perhaps they are not the end that so-called creation serves. That's the second terrifying possibility, that we're the product of unthinking nature, a work in progress, something imperfect, not an end, but simply one moment in an immeasurably long chain of being. And then finally, Freud declares that he himself is the herald of the third and final humiliation. Freud brings forth the psychoanalytical insight that our minds are not our own, at least not in the way that we would perhaps think of the mind in the Christian framework, and even in the secular framework that is onboarding perhaps certain unconscious prejudices that it picked up from Christianity. That we don't control our minds as a rationally governing master. Rather, the contents of one's mind are for the most part unconscious. We do not have control over the unconscious mind, and perhaps in some strange way, it has control over us. This, I would argue, is the most important notion of Freud's, that there is an unconscious, full of feelings, impulses, and even ideas, even notions, philosophical notions perhaps, that motivates conscious action. That the mind is not a unitary and essentialized thing, but a multitude whose operations are not directed as by an arbitrary governor, the ego, but whose operations are in fact the very cause of how the ego acts and how the ego conceives of itself. That, as Nietzsche said, quote, "The great activity is unconscious," end quote. Now, Freud himself might have scowled at my having quoted Nietzsche in order to help explain his ideas, because Freud held that he did not read Nietzsche's books and was not influenced by Nietzsche, at least that he did not encounter the works of Nietzsche until later in his life, when his key ideas were already formed, so to speak. And in fact, Freud seems to have a kind of disdain for Nietzsche, or even a dismissive attitude towards him. We now know, in fact, that these claims of Freud's are simply not true. Anyone can discover this quite easily by picking up a copy of Freud's own first book, The Interpretation of Dreams. And in that work, he cites Nietzsche several times and calls him, quote, "a direct precursor of psychoanalysis in this field," end quote. It was only later, at a meeting of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1908, that Freud famously denied that Nietzsche had any influence on his body of work. He claimed that he tried to read Nietzsche a few times but had always abandoned his attempts, and it was one of Freud's contemporaries, the famous psychologist Alfred Adler, who drew attention to the similarities between Freud and Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Furthermore, Sigmund Freud's friend and biographer Ernest Jones records Freud's later utterance that Nietzsche, quote, "had more penetrating knowledge of himself than any man who ever lived or was likely to live," end quote. And surely this is high praise from a psychoanalyst, and somewhat out of character for Freud, who seemed to look down on philosophers, and especially philosophers named Nietzsche. Now, because of Freud's disavowals, the connection between Nietzsche's ideas and Freud's has been regarded as uncertain in the past. As the evidence stands, the influence is clearly there. But at the end of the day, it's not really important to what extent Freud wished to claim originality from Nietzsche. That's clearly something that Freud was very concerned with, from perhaps an egoistic standpoint. But from my perspective, both things can clearly be true. Freud was indeed an original thinker on many accounts. I mean, you won't find anything like the Oedipus Complex in Nietzsche, but it also seems certain that he read Nietzsche and took influence from him, whether consciously or unconsciously. The two men do in fact agree on a great many things regarding the psyche, and I would argue that Freud's thought can be justifiably seen as a concrete application of Nietzsche's ideas within the field of psychology. By applying those ideas, the result is the creation of psychoanalysis, and for better or for worse, the humiliation of mankind, or at least a humiliation when regarded from the standpoint of our narcissism. Sigmund Freud was born in 1856 in Moravia, which is now part of Czechia. The family moved to Leipzig and then to Vienna. He was a gifted child and he studied Latin and Greek classics even before he embarked on his university education. His family expected that he would study law, but at the last minute Freud changed his mind and enrolled in the University of Vienna as a medical student. He worked at a number of hospitals where he studied, among other things, cerebral anatomy. He worked with individuals known then as psychotics and developed an interest in mental illness. He went on to work with Dr. Joseph Breuer, with whom he published the scientific work Studies in Hysteria. Freud's father died in 1896. He had had a somewhat complicated relationship with his father, and his death prompted a period of deep personal reflection for Freud. It was in 1899 that he published his first major work, delving into the idea of the unconscious, the investigation of dreams. In spite of the actual publishing date, it was marked as published in the year 1900, and Freud said the reason for this was that, quote, "the next century shall be mine," end quote. He published the Psychopathology of Ordinary Life in the following year, in which we first find the idea of the Freudian slip, which is entered into the common parlance. Freudian slip is an unintentional admission or confession of one's unconscious feelings, and it occurs when one misspeaks, or says the wrong word, or says the reverse of what they meant to say. Freud was at the forefront of the psychoanalytic movement. He's one of the figures responsible for creating it, and by the time of the first meeting of psychoanalysts, that aforementioned gathering in 1908, the new field is taking medicine by storm. By the time of the 1920s, Freud published a slew of works that would be massively influential, including Beyond the Pleasure Principle and The Ego and the Id. At the end of the decade, in 1930, he publishes Civilization and Its Discontents. Not long after publishing all of these major works, Freud finds himself in a dangerous position, however, due to the ascendance of the Nazi Party in Germany and then the Anschluss in 1938, in which Germany annexed Austria. With the Nazi control over Austria, Freud, who was Jewish, was forced to flee the country along with many prominent Jewish minds from Vienna. He and his family relocated to London, but Freud did not live to see the end of the war. Freud died of oral cancer in 1939. Freud first had the inkling that there was a great deal in the human mind of which we are not conscious in the course of his study of dreams. His first book, The Interpretation of Dreams, contains much that is autobiographical. Freud writes of the late 19th century Vienna. He describes spending his summers in the Alps, like another German individual that we know who died the year after this book was released. It reads as though Freud was attempting to write an opus. In its first printing, it only sold a few hundred copies, but posterity has smiled on the work, so to speak, and it's now one of the more popular of Freud's offerings. Freud reviews a number of theories, both ancient and modern, concerning dreams, and he wrote in that text, that, quote, "In spite of being concerned with the subject over many thousands of years, scientific understanding of the dream has not got very far," end quote. He describes his own empirical research, wherein a dreaming subject would be exposed to some sort of sensory stimulus, say being tickled by a feather, having the light in the room changed, so on and so forth. And in spite of the obvious fact that the subject is not consciously aware of what's going on in the room, the content of the dream would be reported by the dreamers after waking up as altered or affected in some way by the stimulus received by the sleeping body of the dreamer. We could compare this to an insight that Nietzsche had and wrote about in Human All Too Human, aphorism number 13, quote, "Everyone knows from experience how fast the dreamer can incorporate into his dream a loud sound he hears, a bell ringing, for example, or cannon fire, how he can explain it after the fact from his dream," end quote. It should be noted, the point that Nietzsche is making in that passage, in context, has little to do with explaining dreams. His focus is on the fact that, quote-unquote, dream reasoning seems to proceed backward from the effect to the cause. And Nietzsche argues that perhaps this is an insight into the way that humans originally reasoned while awake. Nietzsche writes, quote, "In the dream, this primordial piece of humanity continues to operate in us, for it is the basis on which higher reason developed and continues to develop in every human being. The dream takes us back to remote conditions of human culture and gives us a means for understanding them better," end quote. And again, even though Freud would go on to disavow Nietzsche, Freud quotes from this same passage in Interpretation of Dreams. Now, Nietzsche here, he is not attempting to explain the purpose, the function of dreaming, as we've already said. His purpose is to gain an insight into the more remote conditions of human culture, as he calls it. But it's worth noting, by the time of Twilight of Idols, Nietzsche has extended this into a critique of human rationality more generally, human causal thinking, where he says that even modern people reason this way while awake. And it ceases to be an observation about more primordial humanity, as he calls it, and becomes a description of conscious reasoning in general, that it's not so different from the dreaming mind as we might like to imagine. For Freud's purposes, on the other hand, much of what we experience in dreams cannot be sourced simply to a response to sense data that has been received unconsciously. So this insight is really just at the beginning of Freud's exploration of dreams, and he had studied hundreds of patients' dreams at this point, and he'd come to regard the dreams that one has as an indication of their mental health. Just as one might attempt to study the hallucinations of a psychotic for an indication of what their condition is, the underlying condition causing the psychosis, Freud began to suspect that the interpretation of dreams might offer a window into the psyche. In other words, dreams could be regarded as a symptom, something that could be interpreted by a physician in order to come to a diagnosis of what is wrong with the patient. What Freud asserts in this text is that, far from being random, dreams constellate disparate and seemingly unrelated elements of someone's life, things they've seen, people they know, places they've been, and assemble them into a story. And while the dream tends to pull from recent sense impressions, from the events of the day before or the previous handful of days, Freud concludes that dreams ultimately reveal something about the self, the meaning of which is far deeper than simply disentangling yesterday's events. That the dream is always a self-contained psychodrama, a revelation about one's own mind. Perhaps the most important conclusion that Freud derives is that dreams aim at wish fulfillment. And famously he writes, quote, "The virtuous man contents himself with dreaming that which the wicked man does in actual life," end quote. The way that Freud comes to this conclusion is through empirical data. He finds that when evaluating patients' dreams, he can almost always find a hidden wish for something that the patient does not or cannot have in real life, and it's fulfilled in the world of their dreams. Freud asserts that the dream almost always disguises this desire because of the unacceptability of it to the subject. One piece of evidence for this, although we could call it circumstantial evidence in the interest of fairness, is that what we call daydreams, our fantasies during our waking hours in which the mind begins to wander, also involve the fulfillment of such unattainable wishes. That's the perennial theme of daydreams. Freud argued that when we sleep, the mind is allowed to fully detach from its conscious scruples and totally lose itself in fantasy. For a wonderful example of a dream in the form of disguised wish fulfillment, we're going to jump ahead to a work called Dream Psychology, which is published in 1920. Freud wrote this as a sort of introduction to psychoanalysis. It serves as a streamlined version of the interpretation of dreams. The example here illustrates Freud's theory of the dream as a desire which is hidden, wrapped up in seemingly unrelated imagery. In fact, it's horrible imagery in this case, but nevertheless speaks to some sort of underlying wish of the patient. So Freud relates the following dream of a unnamed patient. Quote, "A girl dreamt that she saw lying dead before her the only surviving child of her sister, amid the same surroundings as a few years before when she saw the first child lying dead. She was not sensible of any pain, but naturally combated the view that the scene represented a desire of hers. Nor was that view necessary. Years ago, it was at the funeral of the child that she had last seen and spoken to the man she loved. Were the second child to die, she would be sure to meet this man again in her sister's house. She is longing to meet him, but struggles against this feeling. The day of the dream, she had taken a ticket for a lecture which announced the presence of the man she always loved. The dream is simply a dream of impatience, common to those which happen before a journey, theater, or simply anticipated pleasures. The longing is concealed by the shifting of the scene to the occasion when any joyous feeling was out of place, and yet where it did once exist. Note further that the emotional behavior in the dream is adapted not to the displaced, but to the real but suppressed dream ideas. The scene anticipates the long-hoped-for meeting. There is here no call for painful emotions." End quote. There is a very important word that Freud uses in that passage, repressed. The psychical faculty of repression is significant. The mind is censorious. That which is unacceptable for us to consciously desire, the mind represses, pushing into unconsciousness. The fact that we forget our dreams so easily for Freud is evidence of this. As soon as we're awake, the censorious tendencies of the conscious mind begin their work again and push off the content of the dream out of our awareness. For another example, we might consider one of Freud's own dreams, which he discusses in The Interpretation of Dreams. This was a recurring dream, or a recurring theme in his dreams. Freud would often see his own father piss himself, and this usually occurred when Freud had just achieved some great accomplishment in his waking life. This may seem like a strange recurring theme for one's dreams, but for background context, when Freud was a child, he wet the bed. He was actually sleeping in his parents' bed, and he wet the bed then, which was against their rules, right? But of course it was something he did while he was asleep. He wasn't trying to break the rules. But his father remarked at that occasion, when the young Sigmund Freud is ashamed and embarrassed at having done this, that boy will never amount to anything. And this experience seemed to be particularly traumatic for the young Sigmund. And this is indicated by the fact that every time he accomplished something, every time he amounted to something, his dreams fulfilled the wish of not he, but his father, embarrassed by having wet himself. The roles are reversed. Freud, as a man who has indeed achieved great things, can stand in judgment of his father rather than the other way around. So the dream does contain a wish fulfillment. It's not literally that Freud wished to see his father urinate on himself, just as the patient he described did not literally want her sister's other child to die, but that Freud wished to prove his father wrong and reverse the roles, to be the one who stands in judgment, who dishes out the shame, rather than the one who is judged, the one who is shamed. And I'm largely relating to you Freud's own psychoanalysis of his own dreams here. And Freud relates a great number of his own dreams in these texts. And for this, I applaud him. That's the kind of bravery that I could never imagine, airing the contents of my dreams to the world, especially those that would deal with such sensitive subject matter. But here in Freud's dream about his father, we see the inklings of something else. That's one of Freud's more ridiculed ideas, the Oedipus Complex. Freud implicitly sees himself in competition with his father, and he admits he even saw his father as a competitor for his mother's affections. This is Freud's personal insight into the Oedipus Complex, which he would later argue is a universal among all mankind. It's part of our psychological development that all of us have to confront and deal with this secret desire to kill one's father and marry one's mother. And putting it in those terms is, you might say, quite extreme and irrational, but those are the terms upon which the unconscious operates. And to say this is something universal, by the way, I would not interpret Freud as saying that this means that all of us walk around with this secret desire as healthy, mature individuals. Freud sees the Oedipus Complex as a stage in development, something that everyone has to pass through. It's an aspect of Freud's theories that seems somewhat weak to me, by the way, but it is necessary that we go through what he sees as these stages of development of the child's psychology. Each of these stages has to do with sexuality or with an erogenous zone on the body. Freud thinks that if there is some sort of problem or complication in one's development during one of these stages, they will still retain a sort of obsession with that erogenous zone well into their adulthood. So first, the oral stage. In early childhood, when the child is being breastfed, the mouth is associated with pleasure. And if you're weaned prematurely, then you may spend your life as somebody with an oral fixation, constantly trying to gain pleasure through the mouth. And that might manifest quite literally, biting your fingernails or smoking or overeating. Given Freud's death from oral cancer and his own love of cigars, it might be interesting to consider that stage in light of Freud as well as the Oedipus Complex. But in any case, the next stage is the anal stage. When being potty trained, the anus is associated with pleasure. Disruption here can result in a person with an anal fixation. And that's where we get the term like anal retentive. It is sort of associated with like obsessive compulsive behaviors and so on and so forth. The next stage is the phallic stage, in which one derives pleasure directly from the genitals. The Oedipus Complex is what comes after all of these. After the child, in the course of growing and psychologically developing, has to pass through all of these stages. And in the stage of the Oedipus Complex, the child is coming into awareness of their sexuality and seeks out someone who could be the recipient of their sexual desires. And assuming the child is a young boy, his attention turns to the woman who exists in his life at the time of childhood, who's already loving towards him, naturally his mother. But of course, his father is an obstacle to this affection. And Freud says that in healthy individuals, they proceed beyond the Oedipus stage as well. They go on to a sort of latency phase where they stop thinking about sexuality at all because the only object of sexual desire is their mother, but the seemingly all-powerful father figure is too great an obstacle to this desire. And after this, you come into your own as a fully fledged, mature, healthy adult. Now, again, much of what Freud says about these stages of psychosexual development has mostly fallen by the wayside in terms of the thought of modern psychologists. But just to understand the way Freud thinks about this, if a psychologically normal person has progressed beyond these stages and become a fully integrated, healthy adult, what's the opposite of progressing? That would be regressing. And so Freud would later argue many pathologies are in fact regressions to earlier stages of psychosexual development. Perhaps the person, another possibility is not actually a regression, they simply got stuck there. They never progressed beyond the given stage. Now, is the Oedipus complex to be taken literally? Is it the literal desire to kill one's father? I think most of us would take issue with that idea that we all literally wanted to kill our own fathers at some point. But nevertheless, there's something to the notion, especially for many young men. The image of the father can become something quite imposing. I mean, one's father is understandably someone to be admired and to idealize, especially when you're a young man. But then as you start to grow into your adolescence, you naturally begin to acquire the desire to rebel, to differentiate yourself from your father or from the authority figures who really have had total power over you up to that point in your life. And so to become your own person, it may be necessary to attack what the father figure represents. And what's more, as in Freud's case, if your father has belittled you or expressed doubts that you could ever surpass him, we could see how something like a metaphorical desire to kill your father, to liberate yourself from his power over you, could arise. Perhaps the more troubling aspect when it comes to making the Oedipus complex comprehensible is that this is allegedly derived from the desire to marry or sleep with one's own mother, which will strike most people as very strange. Last week, we talked a bit about Freud's work, Totem and Taboo, in our discussion of René Girard in his critique of Nietzsche. That text, as Girard mentions, has been perhaps one of the most maligned among all of Freud's work, and Girard thinks this is because Freud touches on the idea of the collective murder as the beginning of culture, so to speak. It's worth looking at the specifics of that claim, however, as it relates to the Oedipus complex, because in spite of all the shade that's been thrown at that work, I personally find the account that Freud puts forward there in Totem and Taboo to be one of the more convincing explanations of this Oedipus complex phenomenon. Freud describes a kind of psychological myth in that work, a kind of archetypal narrative about primitive societies. He suggests that primitive man would have lived under what amounts to a tyrannical father figure. This could be regarded as the extreme version of the Oedipal father. We might imagine that one male figure rises to the position of rulership and then begins to monopolize the sexual partners in society. He amasses a harem of wives. He denies the opportunity for all the younger men to become husbands and fathers themselves. The reason why this claim is so contentious these days is because there's a considerable degree of skepticism that the earliest human societies actually looked like this. It's likely that we only get these kinds of god kings, these autocrats who control every aspect of society after the creation of agriculture. But nevertheless, we can see the hints of this problem in, for example, the myth of Gilgamesh. The problem at the beginning of the epic is that Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, is exhausting all of the men in the city by forcing them to labor on his behalf, and he's monopolizing the women by taking the so-called Lord's right of sleeping with them on their wedding night, getting the first right to sleep with the women. We might also look to a number of historical figures, warlords such as Genghis Khan, who had countless wives. One could argue we see this kind of perverse dynamic even today in the context of cults, certain Mormon offshoots as well, in which one man, the leader of the community, or a small cadre of men, takes multiple wives for himself or for themselves. And then what does this necessitate? Well, in the case of, for example, a lot of those Mormon offshoot communities that are, it should be said, they're condemned by the LDS Church these days, but they tend to expel as many of the young men from the community as they can. This seems to be a real phenomenon, that males in positions of unchallenged authority will use said authority to monopolize sex in the community. And so even though, a lot of the premises of Freud's Totem and Taboo are maligned, that statement, males in absolute authority will monopolize sex, I think is actually very intuitive and doesn't bear much more arguing for that position. So Freud argues in Totem and Taboo that what must have happened historically is that eventually all of the young men banded together and killed this tyrannical, patriarchal figure. And then they restructured society. Perhaps they established laws against such practices. But perhaps we can also imagine that many of them might have felt some degree of guilt or even horror at this deed. I mean, perhaps this patriarchal, tyrannical father figure was someone they also looked up to, someone who was a model for them. Maybe he was literally the father of some of them, or all of them. And so in the wake of this collective murder that establishes true civilization, not just an autocratic tyranny based on force that just emerges directly out of the state of nature, but a true civilization where laws are established to regulate the behavior of the members, these founding members would perhaps look back to this figure's death as the cause of that civilization. Maybe they would reconceptualize what they did as a sacrifice, reconceptualize this patriarchal figure as a god that was collectively murdered, something that they felt remorse for, but which was necessary. Perhaps it was even demanded. This becomes their way of rationalizing what has happened. It's worth noting that Girard saw his theory of triangulating desire, or mimetic desire, as implicit in Freud's description here. It's implicit in the Oedipus complex. Girard believes that Freud perceived this. The son determines the object of his desire by mimesis. He desires what the father has. The fact that the father has what the son wants and is the obstacle to the son getting it is the source of the conflict between them. Girard thinks that Freud's mistake was in thinking that this dynamic was specific to this family dynamic, but that Freud stumbled upon the same insight vis-a-vis desire that Girard did. Freud's focus is, to be fair, somewhat fixated on the family and on family life. Freud really believes that so much of our psychology is shaped and molded in early childhood. The experiences of early childhood are considered significant to Freud because they certainly have a lasting bearing on our entire lives. Much of early childhood is forgotten, however. We might say it's pushed into the unconsciousness, and so we can see how childhood would hold that sort of fascination to Freud as something that seems to steer the destinies of us adults, even though we mostly are unconscious of it, or we forget most of it. It just kind of becomes a blur, right? Most of us don't have distinct memories of what we were doing when we were 4 versus when we were 5, or what we were doing when we were 10 versus when we were 11 years old. We don't have that kind of granular record of memory from childhood. So, given all of this, let's take a charitable read of Freud's Oedipus Complex. Perhaps many of us have known people in our own lives, had friends or family members, who sought out romantic partners that in many ways resemble their parent of the opposite gender. I don't mean necessarily that they physically resemble them, although that's, usually involved, but that sometimes we get the sense that this person's looking for a parent in their romantic partner, that they find themselves gravitating towards someone who shares personality traits with one of their parents. It's almost a cliche to bring up the example of a young woman with daddy issues or a young man who just wants a partner who's going to take care of him like a mother. But the reason why it is a cliche is because this does seem to be a real phenomenon. And I think it's fair to say it's not universal, and that in fact it would be deeply unhealthy for you to fulfill such a desire. But perhaps that's exactly the point. This unhealthy behavior, strictly from the standpoint of nature, is inexplicable when we regard it strictly from the perspective of our conscious desires or moral standards. From the standpoint of our morality, our moral sensibilities, it's wrong, it's disgusting to desire a sexual relationship with even a surrogate of your mother or your father. No one would ever consciously admit to themselves, or to anyone else for that matter, that what they really want out of a spouse is someone exactly like their mom. And so, even though this phenomenon seems to be recognized to the point that it's almost a cliche, what would we naturally expect, to happen to such a desire? It would naturally be repressed. And so for Freud, this behavior is explained by this Oedipus complex, and this repression is a result of the morality imposed by society. We can see the similarity with Nietzsche here once again, insofar as Freud focuses on the ways in which civilization has acted to stamp down drives or impulses that may have been easily fulfilled when a man was an animal living in a state of nature, but which are unacceptable in the context of an ordered society. As a matter of course, civilization has to prevent individuals from, for example, simply fulfilling their sexual impulse whenever they see fit and with whomever they see fit, or from acting on violent impulses whenever they arise. In fact, we could even say civilization itself is this very process, the process of repressing such urges. It's in some sense identical with repression. That without this active repression of human impulsiveness, civilization does not exist. Some have suggested that the Victorian morality that predominated in Freud's time might have led him to such conclusions, such that sexual feelings, sexual tension, all of this was sort of willfully and studiously ignored in the cultural context in which Freud lived, and maybe this is a way to explain Freud's sexual fixation. But I would argue that Freud's insights here would be applicable in more or less any kind of civilization, which civilization is always premised on a code of morality. Victorian morality is simply a particularly rigid form of such morality. A passage in Nietzsche that I've often cited, which appears in his unpublished notes between 1880 and 1881, concerns the same topic, and shows that Nietzsche was thinking along these same lines. Here, Nietzsche discusses the social mores, that moral code imposed on the individuals by civilization, which primarily takes aim at the unacceptable desires of said individuals. Quote, "The mores are seen to demand that one bear the displeasure of an unsatisfied desire, that the desire be able to wait. To be immoral means, therefore, in this case, not to be able to bear a displeasure despite the thought of the power that makes the rules. A feeling is supposed to be subdued by a thought, more precisely by the thought of fear, whether it be fear of the sacred mores or of the punishment and the shame threatened by the mores. In itself, it is not at all shameful, but natural and fair that a desire be satisfied immediately." End quote. So in the natural state, it's not at all shameful to live like Diogenes, for example. Simply eat when you're hungry, masturbate if you get horny, sleep wherever you want to, and so on and so forth. But if you act that way, you will be socially shunned by everyone else, and if you fulfill those impulses in a way that threatens the social fabric, such as sleeping with another man's wife, well, in many periods of human history, that could get you killed. I mean, it can still get you killed today. It's just far less common. It's not too long ago, though, that in many societies, adultery was a capital offense. And so if you have a sexual desire for another man's wife, such a desire may well emerge, for example, in your dreams. And as soon as you return to the waking world, your conscious mind does its utmost to bury the memory of that dreamed infidelity. There's actually a somewhat remarkable passage by Nietzsche on the topic of dreams, which also references Oedipus. This appears in Daybreak, aphorism number 128. I can't help but think that Freud must have come across this passage because the similarities to Freud's thought are just too striking. Nietzsche writes, quote, "You would wish to be responsible for everything except your dreams. What miserable weakness, what lack of logical courage. Nothing contains more of your own work than your dreams. Nothing belongs to you so much. Substance, form, duration, actor, spectator. In these comedies you act as your complete selves. And yet it is just here that you are afraid and ashamed of yourselves. And even Oedipus, the wise Oedipus, derived consolation from the thought that we cannot be blamed for what we dream. From this I must conclude that the great majority of men must have some dreadful dreams to reproach themselves with. If it were otherwise, to how great an extent would these nocturnal fictions have been exploited in the interests of man's pride? Need I add that the wise Oedipus was right, that we are not really responsible for our dreams any more than for our waking hours? and that the doctrine of free will has as its parents man's pride and sense of power. Perhaps I say this too often, but that does not prove that it is not true." End quote. A remarkable passage in that it contains that fundamental Freudian thought that dreams are wish fulfillment, but wishes that we want to suppress and disavow. Nietzsche says, on the contrary, if you are responsible for anything, you're responsible for your dreams. It's your complete self. But just here, you are ashamed and afraid of yourselves. Oedipus is invoked, but not as he who killed his father and married his mother, but as he who derived consolation from the thought of our irresponsibility for our dreams. There's something psychologically fecund in that notion from the Freudian perspective. The man who enacts the ultimate taboo desire commits the worst crime in the name of that desire, albeit unintentionally in the Oedipus story as it comes to us from Sophocles. Oedipus takes solace in the fact that we can't be held blameworthy for our most secret and unconscious desires, which is what dreams are. So, while these insights into dreaming may be fascinating in and of themselves, this leads Freud to further conclusions about the human psyche, which would constitute his great contribution to human thought. As he wrote in The Interpretation of Dreams, his work in this regard was, quote, "the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind," end quote. Because it's one thing to say that dreams express or attempt to fulfill wishes which we have, but which we can't make conscious. But it's another to then consider, what would it mean to say that we have unconscious wishes? What would it mean to suggest that we have desires that are not within our conscious control or even understanding? Where do these desires exist, one might ask? What is the unconsciousness exactly? Even today, amongst us modern people who are quite accustomed to acknowledging that we have an unconscious, it's difficult to really grapple with the implications because we think of our desires as something over which we have control, to at least some extent, something which we can choose. But if a desire does not even enter into our conscious awareness, how could we have control over it? Freud will go on to argue, in fact, that the lion's share of the mind's content is unconscious. He writes that, quote, "consciousness is only the surface of the mental apparatus," end quote. We might again recall Nietzsche's phrasing that the ego consciousness was the surface and skin of the mind. Or to use another metaphor that we might employ, the mind is like a vast, dark, cavernous realm, and one's conscious awareness is like a lamplight. It shines upon and illuminates the things in the cavern that fall within the field of its rays, within the conscious awareness. But when the lamplight shines in another direction, what was illumined only a moment before sinks back into the darkness, becomes, for all intents and purposes, invisible. This is the Freudian picture of the human mind that emerges, that our conscious attention brings into our awareness a small portion of the mind's contents. And so this means that the picture of the mind that Freud gives us is one which is primarily unconscious. Unconsciousness is the default, we might say. And the ego, the consciousness, the I, is a thing formed on the surface as a result of our systems of perception. Quote, "We shall now look upon an individual as a psychical id, unknown and unconscious, upon whose surface rests the ego, developed from its nucleus, the perception system." End quote. We should say a few things at this point about the meaning of those Freudian terms, the ego, the id, and the superego. First, we'll define the id. Freud gets this term from the writer Georg Grodeck, and Grodeck got the term from Nietzsche. The etymology of this term is fairly interesting. Nietzsche used the German pronoun das Es to refer to the unconscious. This is in contrast to the personal pronoun das Ich, translated as the ego. Freud also uses the term das Es, which he gets from Grodeck, who gets it from Nietzsche. And it was Freud's translator, James Strachey, who gifts us the term id. Id is a Latinization of das Es, which if rendered literally would be the it. So the ego is the thing we call I, and the unconscious is the thing we call the it. We use id in English in order to distinguish it as its own term. Simply calling it the it might be a little too confusing in English, but indeed in the essay, The Ego and the Id, as Freud is grasping toward a description of this thing called the unconscious, he repeatedly refers to it as a something. The unconscious is an it, a something. We don't experience it as me, as the I. It's something else. It's something almost felt to be external to us, even though Freud would argue, really it is us. It's just something perceived by the ego as not I. So Freud writes in that work, quote, "Now I think we shall gain a great deal by following the suggestion of a writer who, from personal motives, vainly asserts that he has nothing to do with the rigors of pure science. I am speaking of your Grodek, who is never tired of insisting that what we call our ego behaves essentially passively in life, and that, as he expresses it, we are lived by unknown and uncontrollable forces. We have all had impressions of the same kind, even though they may not have overwhelmed us to the exclusion of all others, and we need feel no hesitation in finding a place for Grodek's discovery in the structure of science. I propose to take it into account by calling the entity which starts out from the system of perception and begins by being preconscious, the ego, and by following Grodek and calling the other parts of the mind into which this entity extends and which behaves as though it were unconscious, the id." End quote. Because this id, this it, this something, comprises the whole of the mind, consciousness is reconceptualized as something with a transitory nature. The popular prejudice, perhaps, is that individuals are, to put it one way, predictable. That is to say, that we are coherent beings, that the personality is a stable thing. It's a sort of core to the self, and that which is unconscious can be regarded as maybe some things that we've forgotten or some instinctual or lower level brain activity might be fascinating to study, but which is peripheral to the true unity of the self, which is the ego. Freud sees things differently. The ego is not the core, but the surface. Furthermore, it is an unstable thing, a small island on the ocean of unconsciousness, on whose shores ideas and feelings might wash up. But even this is perhaps to understate Freud's case, because the shores themselves are shifting. Freud writes in the same essay, quote, "Experience goes on to show that a psychical element, for instance an idea, is not as a rule conscious for a protracted length of time. On the contrary, a state of consciousness is characteristically very transitory. An idea that is conscious now is no longer so a moment later, although it can become so again under certain conditions that are easily brought about. In the interval, the idea was, we do not know what. We can say that it was latent, and by this we mean that it was capable of becoming conscious at any time. Or if we say that it was unconscious, we shall also be giving a correct description of it. Here, unconscious coincides with latent and capable of becoming conscious. The philosophers would no doubt object. No, the term unconscious is not applicable here. So long as the idea was in a state of latency, it was not anything psychical at all. To contradict them at this point would lead to nothing more profitable than a verbal dispute." End quote. So again, perhaps we'd like to think that we're more enlightened now about the true nature of the mind than these so-called philosophers that Freud is disparaging here. But I would again suggest these tendencies in our conscious thought are ever recurring. There's a sort of arrogance to consciousness, we might say. Perhaps that's my Nietzschean perspective coloring things. What Freud would find to be operative here is not so much pride in the power of consciousness, but rather shame. We regard the unconscious contents shamefully because it's in the unconscious that all of those unacceptable and embarrassing desires are found. The censorious tendencies of the mind actively wish to forget those desires, And this means that for Freud, forgetfulness represents an active force, which opposes bringing these unacceptable contents into our consciousness. Freud continues further down in the same passage, quote, "The fact that in the technique of psychoanalysis a means has been found by which the opposing force can be removed and the ideas in question made conscious renders this theory irrefutable. The state in which the ideas existed before being made conscious is called by us repression, and we assert that the force which instituted the repression and maintains it is perceived as resistance during the work of analysis." End quote. This is another thing that Freud empirically discovered. While sitting with patients trying to uncover the nature of their repressed desires, he found that this repression manifested itself in the conscious resistance of the patient to uncovering said desires, that without even being aware of it, the subject would fight against the suggestions of the psychoanalyst, refuse to acknowledge the unconscious contents as actually their own. They disavowed their unconscious desires. We might think of one of Nietzsche's aphorisms from Beyond Good and Evil, which Freud cites approvingly, and a passage found in the basic writings of Sigmund Freud. But this is Nietzsche, quote, "I have done that, says my memory. I cannot have done that, says my pride. Eventually, memory yields." End quote. You may have noticed, Freud also makes a distinction here between that which is preconscious and that which is suppressed into the unconsciousness. We discussed this somewhat in the second episode on Deleuze, but just as a brief review here, the preconscious could be considered as contents of the psyche which are perhaps instinctive, perhaps it's experienced as an intuition, perhaps it's something that we perceive without being consciously aware of it, and so on and so forth. Freud takes care to distinguish between these preconscious mental contents, which simply have not been raised into the light of consciousness, and that which the mind has actively repressed. The repressed contents, Freud argues, are actually farther from consciousness than the preconscious contents, because the mind has made a determination that this content is harmful, dangerous in some fashion. The mind has actively erected a block, a wall of resistance to halt the conscious mind from becoming aware of these contents. So for Freud, one of the big questions in this essay is, how is it that things come into our consciousness? How is it that thoughts, feelings, impulses, which were unconscious, would breach the surface into the system of perception? The model that Freud comes to is this. The id, the contents of the mind, are normally unconscious and motivate behavior with no need for awareness of said contents at all. The perception system, we might say, does not need to be aware of the mind's inner content. It's only when a compulsion is painful, that is to say, when a compulsion or an impulse is being thwarted in some way, causing us a kind of nagging discomfort from not being fulfilled, that's when it comes into our awareness. Freud writes, quote, "Sensations of a pleasurable nature have not anything inherently impelling about them, whereas unpleasurable ones have it in the highest degree. The latter impel towards change, towards discharge, and that is why we interpret unpleasure as implying a heightening and pleasure a lowering of energetic cathexis." End quote. To clarify that last term, cathexis is the process of allocating mental or emotional energy to a person, object, or idea. As a side note, this is another term chosen by Strachey, which Freud never used. Obviously, he's writing in German. Much of the language that we call Freudian in English is really Stracheyan, I've discovered. The word Freud used is Besetzung, and in his letters, he suggested the English word interest. And so, in other words, when we have a pleasant sensation, this does not require us to allocate more energy, more interest to focus on that sensation. The sensation, the excitation of our system of perception can be experienced, and we don't need to gather our attention, gather our focus upon it. But this is not true when it comes to a painful sensation. The painful sensation draws our attention, it draws our interest, it causes us to fixate even. I think when we consider this physiologically, it becomes rather clear how this would work. If you're just enjoying a walk on a beautiful spring day, breathing in the fresh air, enjoying the sunshine, you just kind of let those sensations wash over you. You don't have to fixate on any individual one of them. I mean, you might just to kind of enjoy, a pleasurable time. But it's when you have a painful physiological sensation, say lingering back pain, that's what draws your attention, your focus. If it persists for a long time, it can start to consume all of your mental energy. It's due to that dynamic that contents of the id make themselves known in the ego consciousness. Freud describes how a blocked or thwarted impulse that wishes to discharge itself can become painful. Quote, "It can exert driving force without the ego noticing the compulsion. Not until there is resistance to the compulsion, a hold-up in the discharge reaction, does the something at once become conscious as unpleasure." End quote. So the relation of the ego to the id, in practice, it's one in which the ego forms on top of the id, so kind of like a crust. You might consider it like the surface of the earth. I know I've mixed a bunch of metaphors in describing this, but it's because on the one hand, it's a very simple idea, and on the other hand, I think it's so simple that it's almost hard to grasp the enormity of it, so to speak. So just like the layers on the Earth's surface, there are layers of the mind that are closer to the id and closer to the surface level. Freud writes, quote, "The ego is not sharply separated from the id. Its lower portion merges into it. But the repressed merges into the id as well, and is merely a part of it. The repressed is only cut off sharply from the ego by the resistances of repression. It can communicate with the ego through the id." End quote. To return to our considerations on dreams, then, that's one of the ways in which the id makes itself known to the ego, brings the unconscious contents into conscious awareness. So we might then ask, what is the system of the mind that suppresses the contents of the id? What is it that is putting up this wall of resistance that halts the vast majority of the id from flooding into our conscious awareness? In Freud's terminology, this is the superego. Freud says that if it were merely the case that the ego were a part of the id, modified by the system for external perceptions, then the situation for human beings would be far simpler. The human condition might not be such a fraught thing in that case. However, just as the id stands metaphorically below the ego, there's something which is above the ego, quote, "a grade in the ego, a differentiation within the ego, which may be called the ego ideal or superego," end quote. I'd like to note again the actual German term, which is Über-Ich, the over-I. I think one of the common misunderstandings concerning the superego is the notion that the superego is somehow rationally deliberating or represents the intellect or is somehow associated with higher order reasoning, none of which is the case. The superego is the voice of your culture or your moral intuitions, really. It's not necessarily the voice of your culture. It's any morality which you have onboarded and unconsciously will bring to bear upon your conduct. And so the ego sits between the blind impulse of the id that says, "I want to go have sex with that woman," and the blind moralizing of the superego that says, "You can't do that. It's morally wrong to have an adulterous affair." And however you end up negotiating that decision, you will then rationalize to yourself as having freely chosen and call that the arbitrary decision of your ego. But in fact, you're being influenced, pushed from above and from below by the id and the superego. Like with all things Freud, the superego emerges as a result of childhood upbringing and for psychosexual reasons. For one, the superego has a biological and historical origin in, quote, "the lengthy duration in man of his childhood helplessness and dependence," end quote. So The superego is suprapersonal. It's the voice of the community, the voice of the social mores, but it exists within us because we are such beings that require this lengthy period of maturation during which we're subject to the authority of others, such as the father figure. And we're dependent on the care and kindness of others, such as the mother figure. But really we could say that man's existence as a social animal and his dependence on the collective has placed him in such a position that he has to have some psychical system for taking into account what the standards of the community are before acting. And this isn't rationally deliberated out, it's inculcated into the mind as a sort of counter impulse. Of course, since Freud sees this system emerging as a result of one's relation to authority figures within the family, once again, we find that the superego is related to the Oedipus complex. He writes, quote, "Its relation to the ego is not exhausted by the precept, 'You ought to be like this, like your father.' It also comprises the prohibition, 'You may not be like this, like your father.' That is, you may not do all that he does. Some things are his prerogative." This double aspect of ego ideal derives from the fact that the ego ideal, that is the superego, had the task of repressing the Oedipus complex. Indeed, it is to that revolutionary event that it owes its existence. Clearly, the repression of the Oedipus complex was no easy task. The child's parents, and especially his father, were perceived as the obstacle to a realization of his Oedipus wishes, so his infantile ego fortified itself for the carrying out of the repression by erecting this same obstacle within itself. It borrowed strength to do this, so to speak, from the father, and this alone was an extraordinarily momentous act. The superego retains the character of the father, while the more powerful the Oedipus complex was, and the more rapidly it succumbed to repression under the influence of authority, religious teaching, schooling, and reading, the stricter will be the domination of the superego over the ego later on, in the form of conscience, or perhaps of an unconscious sense of guilt." End quote. So, in a way, the superego is the authority of one's parents, reinforced by other social authority figures, such as religious teaching, and then internalized. Freud suggests that this mental faculty is what sets man apart from the other species of animals. The stronger one's Oedipus complex, the more powerfully his superego must become in order to counter it. And thus, the superego becomes tasked with repression, to push down the unacceptable impulses back down into the id. And the result is that the superego not only recapitulates to the values or mores handed down to the individual by one's parents, or to speak more precisely, the voice of the authority of the parents, but it is also forever intimately linked with the id. Freud says that it is, in fact, in subjection to the id. The Oedipus complex itself is extrapolated into the entire raison d'etre for the suprapersonal. Freud writes, quote, "The ego ideal is therefore the heir of the Oedipus complex, and thus it is also the expression of the most powerful impulses and most important libidinal vicissitudes of the id. By setting up this ego ideal, the ego has mastered the Oedipus complex and at the same time placed itself in subjection to the id. Whereas the ego is essentially the representative of the external world, of reality, the superego stands in contrast to it as the representative of the internal world of the id. Conflicts between the ego and the ideal will, as we are now prepared to find, ultimately reflect the contrast between what is real and what is psychical, between the external world and the internal world." End quote. Freud's theories, therefore, I think bear resemblance to Nietzsche in perhaps another sense in terms of method. While psychoanalysis, Freud argues, has often been accused of being sexually obsessed, he thinks that accusation is unfair because it's not his attempt to reduce everything to sexuality, but rather to expand the horizons of what man's sexuality means. The comparison to Nietzsche is obvious. Where Freud sees sexuality as the driving force, Nietzsche sees will to power. A term that we have not yet raised is Freud's notion of libido. Freud himself compared it to Schopenhauer's will. Schopenhauer, we may remember, was accused by Nietzsche of creating his whole philosophy from the fact of his own strong sexual impulses and his own desire to overcome them. Schopenhauer sees the blind impulses as the nature of the will within the individual psyche, the force of the will within the individual psyche, we might say, pushing all of us to continue living, to continue life as such, through, for example, sexuality and therefore reproduction. Freud writes, quote, "People have gone so far in their search for high-sounding catchwords as to talk of the pansexualism of psychoanalysis and to raise the senseless charge against it of explaining, quote, everything by sex. We might be astonished at this if we ourselves could forget the way in which emotional factors make people confused and forgetful. For it is some time since Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher, showed mankind the extent to which their activities are determined by sexual impulses, in the ordinary sense of the word." End quote. We cannot ignore that Schopenhauer's struggle with his own sexual urges, if indeed this is the driving motivation behind his philosophy, as Nietzsche charges, does not lead Schopenhauer to have a series of sexual affairs or anything of the kind. And in fact, it produces the world as will and representation. Schopenhauer's sexual urges create this voluminous philosophical magnum opus. And this means that the libido, the driving urges of sexuality, could be regarded as responsible for our creativity, our productivity in the arts and sciences. Freud also likened the libido to the eros described in Plato's Symposium. In this respect, he seems to have shared an influence with Nietzsche, as I've often argued the eros, as Socrates presents it near the end of the Symposium, goes far beyond mere sexuality. It's merely one of its outward manifestations. Eros, love, is not only responsible for our sexual impulses, but more broadly, for the desire to bring something into being which takes after our own nature. It's a creative drive, synonymous with the human quest for immortality in the view of Socrates. The sexual impulse is one manifestation of this because the desire to reproduce satisfies this urge. But Socrates suggests that eros is also the driving force behind philosophy. Freud writes, quote, "Historians of civilization appear to be at one in assuming that powerful components are acquired for every kind of cultural achievement by the diversion of sexual instinctual forces from sexual aims and their direction to new ones, a process which deserves the name of sublimation." End quote. So that's another key term, sublimation, to take the energy, the driving force of the libido, and channel it into new domains of activity. Something that I've brought up on the podcast before, albeit a long time ago, all the way back in season 1, is that Freud is often falsely attributed as the inventor of the term sublimation. In fact, this term was used, as Kaufmann notes in his book on Nietzsche, by Goethe, Novalis, indeed by Schopenhauer. Goethe, for example, says that human feelings and events could not be presented in their original naturalness, but had to be, quote, wrought, prepared, sublimated, end quote. Schopenhauer had spoken of how the representations of the will had to be sublimated into these abstract concepts. But it is once again Nietzsche who provides the modern sense of the term as it was used by Freud. Nietzsche wrote in Human All Too Human, Book 2, Aphorism 95, that, quote, "In the word love, there is so much meaning, so much that stimulates and appeals to memory and hope. The cleverest woman and the lowest man think of the comparatively unselfish moments of their whole life, even if with them eros never soared high. And the vast number of beings who miss love from their parents or children or sweethearts, especially those whose sexual instincts have been sublimated, have found their heart's desire in Christianity." End quote. So here, not only do we have Nietzsche invoking the eros, we have his implication that the Christian conception of love is a sublimation of sexuality. That love in the Christian sense becomes something which expands beyond the sexual, becomes a term for actions which are in general unselfish, even self-sacrificing, the love of one's fellow man. This is certainly not supposed to be sexual in nature. Nietzsche's insinuation here is that this kind of supposedly higher love is a sublimation. It's a sublimation of the kind of sensuality or sentimentality that originates in sexual love. The idea of sublimation was certainly central to the work of Nietzsche, because with him, it's not sexuality per se, but a base impulse or instinct of any kind, something which is amoral, unconscious, blind, perhaps even vicious or violent. All of these drives for Nietzsche are sourced to the will to power, such that all of our pursuits of the arts and sciences can be seen as expressions or manifestations of the will to power. And that's the main difference between Freud's approach and Nietzsche's. Kaufmann writes, quote, Zarathustra refers to the will to generation as an instance of the will to power, but procreation seemed to Nietzsche merely one manifestation of the creative eros, which could also manifest itself in other ways. Nietzsche's development of this point is full of allusions to Plato's Symposium, which almost certainly suggested these ideas to him. Thus, Nietzsche points out that most of the great philosophers were not married, and explains the matter as follows, end quote. Kaufmann then quotes Nietzsche from Genealogy, Essay 3, Part 8, quote, As for the chastity of philosophers, finally, this type of spirit clearly has its fruitfulness somewhere else than in children. Perhaps it also has the survival of its name elsewhere, its little immortality, end quote. Kaufmann also brings up a quote from Nietzsche's notes, quote, Making music is another way of making children, end quote. Nietzsche's coinage there, I think, fits right in with Freud's psychoanalytic approach to human life. Again, Freud centers sexuality perhaps to a degree that is overwrought, and he may be in the unenviable position of having put forward an idea that Nietzsche had already articulated in arguably a more nuanced way. Freud takes many of these same insights and applies a hyperfocus to sexuality. But perhaps if we are to steelman the Freudian case, perhaps there is a utility to that. I've already mentioned how the Victorian age had tried to hide sexuality, but even though we're very far from that type of morality today, we can still see how there is a considerable shame associated with sexuality. It remains something that's personal and private, the kind of topic that one discusses with their romantic partner, maybe their very close friends or confidants, but which is not the kind of thing you'd discuss with your parents, for instance. But even in our modern world, which has apparently liberated our sexuality to a degree unseen in ages past, the taboos around open discussion of sexuality remain. Again, there seems to be at least an arguably good reason for this from the standpoint of managing a civilization. There has been some degree of research on the utility of monogamy, for instance, and one of those positive benefits might involve the prevention of another such tyrannical, patriarchal male figure who monopolizes all the sexual partners. Monogamy basically stops that kind of thing from happening. And if Freud is correct that every kind of cultural achievement requires the diversion of sexual aims from their impulsive, instinctive, physiological, base type of discharge of that impulse, then perhaps this repression of sexuality has positive effects. Perhaps it's something necessary. It's something to which we owe all of our civilizational capital, all of our cultural capital, all of those achievements. But so long as sexuality remains private, undiscussed, hidden, repressed, we might say, there's always going to be shame associated with it, and it will continue to be motivating of pathologies, motivating of maladaptions among individuals. Kaufmann argues that Freud does not take sides for the sexual impulses any more than Nietzsche advocates for blind, excessive displays of power. Both of them see these drives as the underlying forces to which we can attribute all of those great accomplishments. Perhaps Freud himself, for example, would not have accomplished all that he had if his father had not said that the young Sigmund would never amount to anything after that incident when he wet the bed. Maybe his Oedipal relationship to his father, in which, Freud secretly desired to supplant him as the authority, make his father ashamed rather than he himself being ashamed, maybe this points to that fact. But of course, this might lead us to another supposition, which, it must be said, is quite in keeping with Freud's own psychoanalytic approach, as well as with Nietzsche's perspectival attitude. Perhaps the Oedipus Complex was central to Freud more so than something universal to everyone. Perhaps we could regard his theories as being a confession more than anything else. One of Freud's famous sayings goes that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It doesn't have to be interpreted as a phallic symbol. He was mature enough to admit that. But there's an inverse to this as well. I'm reminded of a particular anecdote involving Carl Jung. Jung and Freud famously worked together, and eventually they split. They had a falling out as Freud increasingly tried to monopolize the discipline of psychoanalysis, cast out anyone who was not willing to capitulate to Freud's ideas of the Oedipus complex and the libido as the primary human drive. Jung was among those who broke with Freud over this controversy. Jung, as is commonly known, put forward the idea of synchronicity, unexplained coincidences in which some seemingly random event would correspond to the inner psychological struggles of one's life. Oftentimes, that which one tried to ignore about their own psychology would appear before them in the form of an image which could be interpreted symbolically. As Jung said, that which remains unconscious in us, we will project onto the world and experience as something external. But Jung's theories of synchronicity really do involve people who encounter, strange or just unusual occurrences that could be interpreted as a sort of message or a sort of signal that something deeper is going on. So after his break with Freud, Jung was working with a patient, a young woman, trying to work through her issues over the course of psychiatric treatment. Jung recalls that many indications presented themselves to him, like that in retrospect he could see that it was so obvious that this woman's problems were sexual in nature, that her pathologies were really actually a result of her psychosexual development. And with a remarkable degree of self-awareness, Jung admits that he resisted this kind of diagnosis with the patient, looking for any kind of explanation beyond the psychosexual, since he was, consciously or unconsciously, unwilling to capitulate to Freud's theories, as the break was still relatively fresh. Then a synchronous event happened in the interpretation of Jung. One morning, while in a therapy session with a young woman, which, as it happened, was outside on a spring day, a pair of birds landed on the ground right next to them and started having sex, right in front of them. The event prompted laughter from both Jung and his patient and allowed Jung to get over the resistance to the possibility that this woman's problems were sexual in nature. The block was overcome, and Jung proceeded with treating the patient. But the moral of the story is that sometimes a cigar isn't just a cigar. That's all for our discussion of Freud, everyone. And since we've just brought up Jung here at the end, maybe that'll serve as a teaser of the next major figure we're going to talk about on the podcast who responds to Nietzsche. We can't talk about Freud's relationship to Nietzsche without bringing up Jung. And I've been waiting to talk about Jung for quite a long time on the podcast, and I think the time is finally right. Although the very next episode that's going to come out sequentially on the podcast is going to be an interview, and it's one that I'm rather excited about sharing with you all. So I hope you'll join me over the coming weeks for, I think, some bangers. Some good episodes are going to be coming. And we're signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.